We there? Good day. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Before we begin this evening, I would like to thank all the volunteers who have been involved in the transfer of barracks from the Longley School to the East Bendigo Hall and in the setting up of our new headquarters there. Over the last 3 weeks, I've been very impressed by people's willingness to engage, to commit their time and energy, and to really cooperate in what was at times quite a complex operation. After 3 working bees, we are getting there. The spaces at Bendigo East have been transformed. Our radio operations and training rooms are now taking shape. 5 maintenance requests are in with the City of Greater Bendigo at present, seeking approval for flagpoles and masts, signage and carpet and acoustic baffles for the ops room. More will follow. We are placing Barracks brand on Bendigo East and turning it into a landmark facility, the visible presence of amateur radio in Central Victoria, and a new kind of asset to the community to meet the needs of our times. On the subject of our times, for those visiting Bendigo East, there are a couple of rules. These will come as no surprise by now. Hand hygiene, social distancing and face masks are now compulsory for the foreseeable future. In addition, cleaning procedures will be undertaken after every use of the hall, and the external doors will be kept open while the hall is occupied to maximise ventilation. The 2020 Trans-Tasman competition is on this weekend. For reasons of social distancing, Barrack has suspended the use of the club call sign, so we are not fielding a team this year. But we know that the diehards among us will be on the air and we wish them all well. Good hunting, gentlemen, make us proud. The usual 80 metre, 6 metre and 2 metre nets, as well as the digital nets, are still running, and I encourage everyone to participate in these and to consider stepping up to act as net controllers. Net control is nothing like as difficult as it may sound and has real benefits to on-air confidence and skills. So go on and have a bash. The subject of tonight's presentation is amateur radio and emergency communications. Barrack's strategic plan of 2019 to 2024 has committed us to the establishment of a regional communications network that will serve the community in times of emergency. We are already in the process of obtaining access to the necessary infrastructure, with network stations to be set up at Bendigo East in the south, Rochester to the east, and now Gredgwin near Quambatook in the north. A 4th station will be sought to the west, possibly at the West of England site. Together, these stations will provide overlapping and redundant coverage across the great majority of the Loddon-Campaspe region, Barrack's backyard. Our technical minds are now looking into the new technologies that might be deployed to access this new network. But a key element is missing from this plan. What role will Barrack's new network play in a regional emergency? The emergency services are already well provided with independent and robust communication systems. But as we have seen in the Black Saturday and Black Summer events, communities are left isolated and placed under greater threat when power systems are shut down or when telco systems fail because of damage or overload. The loss of these critical infrastructures creates breaches in the community's ability to talk to itself. Barrack's role will lie somewhere in those voids. Our purpose this evening is to learn more about them and about what we can do to help fill them. Our guest speakers are Mark Hudson VK3MDH. Mark is a specialist emergency responder dealing with dangerous goods. He is studying a Bachelor of Emergency Management through Charles Sturt University. Mark will be providing us with an overview of WICEN and an insight into the future of amateur radio in emergency communications. Chris Morley VK3CJK. Chris is a WICEN member and will talk about Exercise Magpie, a community and integrated emergency communications exercise held in conjunction with Latrobe City, Baw Baw Shire, Department of Health and Human Services and WICEN. John Morrisey VK3ZRX is also a member of WICEN and involved in the Special Communications Unit, and will be talking to us about the Emcomm Net HF Radio system. Good evening to you, gentlemen, and thank you for your time this evening. I believe that that's the correct order of events. So Mark, VK3MDH, if I can hand over to you. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Mark.
Thanks, Neil. About the only change is Chris will be up third, John will go second, and Chris will bring us home and keep us all awake. Can everyone hear me? Everything's good?
Yes.
Yep. Thanks for the thumbs up, guys. I'll share a screen just in a few minutes, but I'd just like to also thank, on behalf of WICEN, the Barrack Club, for allowing us to speak with you tonight. These three presentations are all interwoven, so if we can hold any questions until the end, because some questions may be answered as the presentations flow, and we've designed these presentations to, I guess, be joined, so at the end you have a holistic approach. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and I hope everyone can see that. Thumbs up if you see my screen. Thanks, Graham. Okay. Emergency response is a way of life. Emergencies never happen when it's convenient. You may find yourself working with others that don't share the same passion. That's been some of my experience. And I'm on call 24/7, and the phone always goes when it's the most inconvenient time. So fingers crossed it's not going to go tonight. In fact, since this COVID thing's come about, the number of road traffic accidents involving dangerous goods has been greatly reduced. There's just less traffic on the road and less people on the road to cause those trucks to run off the road. Okay, whoops. So just a little bit of the history of WICEN first off. We all know what WICEN stands for. It's an acronym, the Wireless Institute Civil Emergency Network. WICEN was established in the 1980s. It has been an accredited emergency response plan agency since 1986. Became incorporated as WICEN in 1989. It's associated with the Wireless Institute of Australia, the Victorian division, and we are activated under the Emergency Management Victoria system by Victoria Police. We are not associated, for those who don't know, with we have an association, but we are not part of WICEN New South Wales or WICEN in Queensland. Sometimes I find that's a little bit of a misconception when people say things like, well, WICEN New South Wales did this, why haven't you guys been involved? We are all separate organisations, even though there is some connection. The activations that WICEN have been involved with go back as early as 1983, the Ash Wednesday bushfires, and the last activation for WICEN Victoria was in 2009 bushfires. So you can see there's been a long time between drinks. There is quite a complex framework that we work under. Under Section 7 of the Emergency Management Manual Victoria, we are a response agency, and as I said earlier, we are spun up by VicPol. We don't self-deploy. And under that, Section 7, which is currently being reviewed, and we've had direct input into EMV, we are the provision of communications or supplementary facilities for and between response and or recovery agencies. and the provision of communications to the community where conventional communications facilities are not available. And I'm not going to open those links, but there are quite a lot of manuals that you can easily Google and find on the EMV website around the various frameworks that response agencies have to work within. And you can see from this slide, from right up the top from cabinet right down to the municipal level, and this comes from, I think it's section 6. There are quite detailed frameworks on which response agencies are required to work within. In fact, there's a whole processes that all the response agencies from the Vic Poles and fire, ambulance, SES, Red Cross, there is quite a, DELP, all those people work within this framework, EMMV. And as we know, when a natural disaster strikes, there is a failure of communications. And there's one of our members, Paul 3YFF, who's on this call, working in the rear of a vehicle on one of our public safety exercises. Systems get overloaded, systems become unstable, systems stop working, and there needs to be the means to put a stopgap in place when those things happen. And that's why WICEN has existed under that framework since 1986. Just a very high level overview. We use a couple of digital systems. We use a system called TRAC that was actually written by Paul VK3YYF, who I've mentioned is on this call. TRAC is a system that allows us to track, by the name, people, vehicles, and we use VHF, UHF in using that system. We also use WinLink, Winmore, RMS Express. I think it's just, they've dropped the RMS part now, and it's just WinLink. And Paul DPW runs a gateway down there in Dramana. Thumbs up, Paul, if that's the case. And Paul, I think, said the other night that they've even dropping one of the sound parts of it and using VARA HF now for WinLink. And we also use a system called Emcomm Pactor, and John's going to give a presentation in depth in that up next. WICEN is a community-based organisation, and we find ourselves involved in a lot of different events. We do a lot of car rallies, a lot of motorbike rallies, a lot of people events, running, walking, and things like that. And a lot of the events we do, by the nature of the fact that mobile phones don't work too well in places like the high country, is up in the high country. So we find ourselves doing a lot of the public safety events outside the Melbourne metropolitan area. And in fact, I've been on events where groups of people have been lost out in the middle of nowhere because of the fact they've relied on their cell phone with Google Maps to go off-roading, and realise when they get 15-20 kilometres into the Talangi State Forest that their maps aren't any good to them on their phones. We do a lot of training, and training is really important. You get to know your equipment. WICEN operators need to be self-sufficient. So if we're out for 1, 2, 3 nights, we need to be able to take care of our shelter, our food and water. We need to be able to navigate. We also put a lot of planning into comms plans before we do exercises. So knowing your comms plan, a lot of radio procedure and log keeping, and in fact in the work I do now on road traffic incidences, I feel like I'm on a WICEN event because I'm just the requirement to keep good logs, what happens and when, so documentation. Familiarity with other team members is really important, and also to try and train in as near real world conditions. And in fact, Rob Graham, a well-known Victorian psychologist who works a lot in bushfire recovery and also working with COVID-19 recoveries, actually talks about himself being in a fire situation, grabbing his little walkie-talkie to talk to his wife and finding he couldn't operate it because he hadn't trained to use it in smoke and under duress. So working on an event where you have a lot of noise going on in a comms room is actually good training, even though it doesn't seem it at the time. You find a lot of things become muscle memory if you train a lot. And we also train in the hope that we never need to be doing what we're training for, because no one wishes to have a disastrous situation placed on a community. Operators need to be passionate about public service, as I mentioned before, when you call family. So you really do need to have a passion for communications. You need to be available, flexible, adaptable. Often you find you've got to be very diplomatic because you may find yourself dealing with a lot of different people, from agencies that you're serving to the customer, the client. We operate in all conditions. We're self-sufficient, and you have to be kind of willing and able. Certa Cito, that means swift and sure, and that's the motto of the Australian Signal Corps, and I think it just really resonates with the work that you do in public service with communications. You have to be quick and you have to be sure what you're doing. So now I'm going to address the white elephant in the room. This is the bit where it gets a little maybe political, maybe, and I call it the thin grain line. So why amateur radio operators most likely won't be used within a disaster by response agencies. As you saw before, amateur radio operators in Victoria haven't been used since 2009. That's 11 years. And it hasn't been through a lack of trying. Australia is not the US, and we're not a third world country. For example, in the US, they have over 1,000 agencies. You can imagine Bendigo, Geelong and Victoria. If we were in the US, each of us would have our own state police, we'd have our own metro police, we'd have the sheriff's department. They'd all be trained differently, they'd all be on different radio systems, and they'd be a mixture of career and paid police officers. And there'd be another few layers of different agencies within the state of Victoria. Well, we have VicPol, we have Victorian Ambulance, and we have SES, and we have all these agencies that cover the whole state, and in some cases like the SES Australia-wide. So we don't have the interoperability issues that they have in the United States, and we certainly don't have the issues in Victoria that they do in some of the third world countries. Agencies have developed technologies and networks with minimal downtime that have proved to be reasonably solid in the recent fire season. There is a committee that meets that I'm just going to it's called the State Emergency Response Planning Communications Subcommittee. That's a mouthful. The SERPCSC, and they report to the State Planning Committee. and there's about 40 agencies involved in that committee. And at their last meeting, which was I think February of this year, they all spoke about how well the communications network held up in the recent fires. Yes, there were some issues, things around not necessarily maybe having the data of the runtime of gen sets under full load at certain locations. And of course, you will get fire, maybe burning over a site and causing disruption. It's inevitable regardless of whether it's a repeater or something else. So the uptime of the statewide system for all agencies was very, very solid. And where they didn't, where they had some gaps, they were easily able to pick up 150 handheld radios from Surf Life Saving Australia that weren't being used, quickly reprogram them and hand them out to, say, ADF staff. Hasn't been a big issue with the communication systems, as there was in the 1980s, 1990s. We now have things around fitness to work. Our agencies want people, if they're going to come with and work with them, to be capable of meeting certain fitness criteria. For example, just doing low-level work, if you're working in say, the rail industry, and I have to have one of these every 2 years, I have to do an audiometry, a visual test, musculoskeletal screen, and medical history, as well as drug and alcohol testing. And that's just for me to flash a card to say if a train has a derailment and there's some dangerous goods on there, I'm allowed to stand in the rail corridor in Victoria. I'm not allowed to do anything else, but our served agencies require us to have a certain physical requirement. There are assurance issues, and also we don't train with our served agencies. Our training is not aligned to our customers' requirements. And the other issue, and I'm talking here about radio operators in general, not WICEN, is there's the non-integration into the state's EMMV framework. And as you saw from some slides earlier, there is quite a well-defined legislative framework if anyone is going to get involved, that you have to be within that framework. And this last point is quite an interesting point, and it comes from a study that RMIT did in August in 2019. And again, these things are publicly available. And in that RMIT study, they looked at 48 community sector representatives in Australia, and they found there was a significant and widening gap between expectations and capacities of community sector organisations in emergency management, and that was really concerning. Community sector participants see current volunteering models and approaches as broadly unsustainable over time. We have ageing members, and we have a reduced number of people who are wanting to get involved in being passionate about doing work. There are trends that show that this will not change. There is also an issue around our national and international policymakers not having the stomach to want to have volunteers involved with the response and recovery efforts in an emergency. A lot of our agencies are grabbing the budgets, the dollars when they're available, and implementing and forming their own ways of filling those gaps. So I think there is a reluctance from other agencies and government to have volunteers involved in the response and recovery efforts in a disaster. The importance of community-based clubs. So, kind of put a bit of a a bucket of water there on the fire, and everyone's going, well, okay, so we may not ever be used. Amateur radio is a science-based hobby, and operators need to have a common competency basis of training if they're to be used on air. So we see clubs as being extremely important in the future of emergency communications. A lot of clubs, a lot of I should say governments now around the world since COVID are allowing people to do online exams. I know when I went and did my exams, I joined a club. Part of the membership fee of the club was you got to go along to all those 12 weeks of classes. You got to meet other club members. You got to enjoy hanging out with them and learning about what it's like to operate on air, aside from the science base of the hobby. Local knowledge and clubs are community driven, and you're locally integrated. And in the case of any support from a disaster response, that's going to come from outside the DZ, the danger zone. And clubs will be able to support other clubs in other areas, as I've said there in that last point. So from your club's point of view, if you're to get involved with emergency response, if we call it that, or some sort of communications within your community, I would emphasize that you look at the how your club can be used at the micro level. And Chris is going to speak more on this in the final presentation, so I'll leave it at that. You will be supported because in an emergency response situation, most people in the area that the emergency is happening is dealing with their own issues, their own properties, their own families. Help will come from outside your area to support you. So clubs that are integrated with WICEN or with a common way to approach operating in this situation will, I think, be far more successful than those who just go it alone. And you will be measured by your inactions rather than your actions. And I truly believe that something needs to be done. And if anyone's involved in engineering, you'll understand, or quality control, you'll understand the Swiss cheese sort of theory. And I just want to talk briefly, just as I conclude, how we can make a difference. In 2016, October of that year, WICEN was on a public safety event. It was a motorcycle event with about 400 people. The organisers of that event were mostly organised. Some of the areas where they weren't mostly organised was in the area of communications. They had provided the field doctors and paramedics with sat phones, but only issued them the sat phones on the first day of the event. They also had not organised Melbourne Ambulance Victoria's event commander to be the same event commander for the 4 days of the event. So each day we had a different event commander. Well, on day 3 of the event, while I was in what we call the HQ, AWI, a call came in to the clerk of the course that there was a rider with an issue. And it was only by pure coincidence of overhearing that the clerk of the course had received this call by phone that we intervened. We obtained further details about this patient and found that the patient was about a 15-minute four-wheel drive from where our closest radio operator was, and that was about an hour from our HQ. So we tried to get the Melbourne ambulance commander on the sat phone that was issued to him. Well, guess what? It didn't work. We tried to ring him on his personal mobile. Guess what? It didn't work. And by the way, this event was up in Merrijig, up in the Mansfield area. So they tried ringing the event paramedics that were in the field that were issued with sat phones. They did not work. I just happened to recall somebody saying that the Melbourne Ambulance Troopy had a CB radio in it. And we often, on events, run that dirty word CB. Why? Well, a lot of times on events, the people involved with running the event will have CBs in their card, UHF CBs or handhelds. So we put a call out for Melbourne Ambulance on Channel 5 on UHF CB. Well, the troopy was out at Sheepyard Flat, too far away to hear the call, but Melbourne Ambulance Victoria Mansfield station was monitoring UHF Channel 5. They came back and through their statewide radio network said they would give the event commander a call on their radio system, which they did, and alerted him to the fact that we had a patient requiring extrication up in the high country. It took us about 2 hours and 20 minutes before we had that patient extricated and down to a LZ where HEMS was able to land and fly that patient back to Melbourne for treatment. The doctor came into AWI that afternoon, and she was a very one of these European female doctors that spent most of her life working in third world countries, and I think she was Hungarian or something, and she came up and she just wrapped her arms around me and gave me a big hug, and then started telling us that we weren't allowed to go away the following day on day 4 of the event because if it wasn't for WICEN, the outcome for this patient may have not been the same. Apparently, she was bleeding out. She had an injury to the upper thigh, and her blood pressure was dropping quickly. So if she wasn't extricated in the time frame she did, the outcome for her may have been different. Fortunately, day 4 didn't require us there because of the nature of the event. But it's a personal story of one of my events where we did make a difference. So while we may not be supporting CFA and other served agencies in disasters, there is still a solid place for amateur radio operators doing public safety events. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to John now. If I could there, Graham, and John will now talk about the Emcomm HF system.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. I will just in turn share my screen and we'll get this slideshow running. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Yes, looks like we're all good. Okay, well, as Mark said at the start, thanks very much for this opportunity to come along and have a chat about WICEN and related matters. So not something we do terribly often, but it's really good when we do. A little bit about me. I've been an amateur radio operator for more years than I care to remember, and I've been a member of WICEN for about 20 odd years. Now, Mark did mention about some of the WICEN systems that we run. There's TRAC, which is using packet radio, generally on VHF, and it's got some important messaging and other functions for emergency communications. It was developed as Mark said, initially for tracking competitors and vehicles and things like that, but it does have broader uses. The second system we use is WinLink, which is, I suppose a good description is a email system operating over radio, and it's quite extensively used around the world. And the third one, which I'm going to be talking about, is the Emcomm system, or Emcomm Win, which was developed especially for emergency communications, and it was developed a bit over 20 years ago. It's a very interesting system. I don't know of anything else like it in Australia, certainly not in Australia. So here's a bit more about it. So a little while ago, it was in 1997, but it was actually in Victoria, an organisation called RECOM, Red Cross Communications, was established to help with Red Cross. And most of the work was done by three amateurs in particular. It was done by John Patterson, VK3ATQ, who's a high-level scientist, if you don't know John. He worked for a long time in CSIRO, including on the over-horizon radar and other things. His brother Donald, VK3BPD, who is a top-class mathematician and also a programmer, and Warren Sterling, VK3XSW, were the main people involved. And what Red Cross were looking for was a reliable and secure communication system for registering evacuees. At that time, Red Cross had the job of registering all evacuees from an emergency, and then that information had to be cast on to Canberra. So RECOM was set up to do this work for Red Cross and any other comms work that was needed as well. So RECOM came into being. It was quite a small group. It was never bigger than 14, generally around 12 or thereabouts, and including scientists, engineers, mathematicians, programmers, you name it, all sorts of people who could contribute. And from scratch, they developed this high-performance emergency communication system. The system they developed was called RECOM Win, was mainly for the Red Cross, but it included many other very interesting features specifically for emergency communications. They had a pretty stiff set of requirements they had to meet too, and these are some of the requirements they had to meet. It had to be long range because they couldn't assume that they could rely on something close in. For example, they were used in floods in Queensland, which covered a wide area. It had to be independent of other infrastructures, so couldn't rely on power, couldn't rely on existing communication system. It had to be independent. It had to be secure because at times there may have been very sensitive information passing over it, such as somebody's medical condition, or maybe even if somebody had passed away. So obviously you do not want that sort of information getting loose at any time. It had to be very robust. In other words, it had to perform very well under poor conditions. We all know that HF is not that reliable at times, and conditions can get pretty poor, but the system really had to be such that it could keep going if at all possible, and it had to be reliable. So the equipment could not afford to fail out in the field. Another requirement was it had to be auditable, and that's an interesting thing for a radio system. Because it was used for passing sometimes very important emergency messages, it had to have things in to say, where did the message come from? Where did it go to? Who sent it? What time was it sent? What time was it received? All of this sort of business. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And the whole system had to be able to be deployed very quickly. John Patterson has told me that they used to get phone calls that there is a caribou leaving in 2 hours from Essendon, be on it. So yes, they had to be able to get away very quickly. Out of all these requirements, they came up with some design philosophy and some optimization they needed to do. So it had to be extremely robust. It had to have what we call minimal channel occupancy. In other words, there was a lot of work put into it to try and reduce the amount of data that had to be actually transmitted by radio. And that's quite important. It also had to have transparent encryption, so the operator didn't need to do anything to make it work. He just turned the system on, clicked a couple of buttons, and away it went. Messages, it had to be able to pass emails if necessary. It had to be able to pass messages in standard emergency comms format, and also it needed to be able to post to an internet web page. And we'll talk about that internet posting a little bit later on, because it's a very flexible system, and we'll see one of its practical uses. Another important thing they built into the system was, if a file is being transferred and the link is lost, it had to be able to pick up again from where it had left off. So you could lose the link completely, reconnect, and it would just keep going. And as part of the auditability requirements, all the data, so the actual stuff that went through the system, the actual information, and the metadata, things like location, time, and what have you, all of that had to be stored for later access in a file that nobody could get at and fiddle with. And that requirement, incidentally, came from the Victorian coroner, who they spoke to when they were developing this system. So the actual technology they decided on in the end was HF radio. Now, as we all know, HF can be pretty ornery at times with propagation and things like that. So a part of that is what we call active frequency management. And I'll have a bit more to say about that a bit later on. The modulation system they chose was PACTOR 2, and then when it became available, PACTOR 3. And basically that's about the best available, and we'll talk about why that is a little bit later on too. All the software was written for the purpose. It was developed from scratch. Donald Patterson, VK3BPD, I mentioned he's a mathematician. His particular interest is in encryption, as it happens. So he built a custom strong encryption system with rolling keys just for this application. We had to be careful about network security. There were some attempts to penetrate the network, unfortunately, by some unscrupulous amateurs. The system does include security, so that there are individual keys, for example, on every user. That's compared against a whitelist, and we also have precautions to make it more difficult to penetrate the actual radio network itself. To make sure that everybody is talking from the same time, all the stations in the network are synced back to GPS time, which means within about a second, and all the transactions are recorded in secure and encrypted files. So we met the auditability requirement. And here's a photo of Robbie VK3EK, who was a member of Recom for quite a long time. So what did the system offer? It offered standard format messaging, which is a pretty common emergency comms system of to, from, priority and all that sort of thing. What we call GPS posting, which is posting information to a Google map, data map. It's got automatic email, which is outgoing only. We do not allow incoming email because of some problems which can arise from that. It can report weather, and we can also interrogate weather remotely. It can interrogate position remotely, and that's a very useful thing to have. For example, that was used after Black Saturday to track convoys up north of Melbourne who were travelling through the burnt out areas. And one of the conditions of the police allowing the convoys in was they had to be tracked. So they were. And of course, the system can transfer any type of file. It's not restricted in the way that, for example, email will not allow you to transfer potentially nasty files like executables and things like that. Now, I mentioned Recom from time to time had to fly out. They had 3 of these things, which were what they called a fly kit, which was simply a case full of radio goodies, the radio, the modem, cables, antennas, all sorts of things, which could be airlifted at any time. And those things travelled all over Australia. Basically, all you needed to do was add a computer and add a 12-volt power supply, and off you went. Now, I mentioned that active frequency management was a really important thing about all of this. I don't know if anybody's seen one of these things. This is what's called an hourly area prediction chart, and it's actually a chart which is specific for the Emcomm group, or for Recom as it was. This particular one is between Fiji and Australia, and the different colours show the recommended frequency to communicate with Fiji in that particular area. So for example, on this particular map from Melbourne to Fiji, you would probably be wanting to use either the 7 meg or the 10 meg band from the light green colour. These maps are publicly available. You just need to search for them on the Bureau of Meteorology Space Weather Services map, and you'll be able to get to them. But they cover quite a range of destinations that we're interested in. There are 2 sets of maps that we use. One's for forecast, 24 hours ahead, and the other one is based on real-time radiosonde data, so it's pretty accurate of what's happening right now. So I guess one of the really important questions about this whole system that Recom used was it a success? Well, I think it was. In 14 years, they were called out, I believe, about 143 times. Was mainly for fires and floods. They covered all of Australia. I think they went to every state in the end, and were away for, each operator was away for up to a week at a time, and then they changed over. Over this whole time, the system never failed, which is a real big tick as far as emergency comms are concerned, and it goes to show just how carefully and how well the system is designed. Another interesting thing is that it was used in the 2003 fires, and Recom had an operator in Omeo up in East Gippsland, and all of the agency comms from Omeo to the outside world were knocked out by the fires, and for quite a few days the only comms out of Omeo for the AMBOs, for CFA, for police, everybody, the only comms available were the Recom comms. So they really did themselves proud. Anyway, all these things come to an end. Recom was disbanded by Red Cross. There was a change of legislation which meant that Red Cross no longer needed to handle evacuees. And so Red Cross didn't need Recom anymore. And Red Cross disbanded, and they reformed themselves into what we now know as the Emcomm group. And in due course, Emcomm offered the technology to WICEN for emergency comms use, and we took it up. And as a matter of interest, Emcomm, as a separate organisation to WICEN, is now also operating in the South Pacific, and I'll talk about that in a moment as well, with some stations in Tuvalu and Fiji. And this came in very useful late last year and early this year. So within WICEN, we set up what we call the Special Communications Unit to use this system that Emcomm was offering to us. And as well as all the equipment, Recom had an organisation model that was fairly unique. Some pretty steep requirements on their operators. They had to be ready to leave at very short notice. Had to have very reliable equipment. Operators needed to be very well trained, not just initially, but also there's ongoing training which occurs every week. And that training from Recom onwards and through to Recom and the WICEN SCU has been going for over 20 years. Had to be fast response, and because if you are asked to go somewhere on one of these things, you will be by yourself, and failure is not an option. And as Mark said, that is why we train. We have to make sure that we can do the task that is asked of us. Now, the Emcomm system is not just field stations. There's also a network of effectively gateways to the internet, what we call network stations, and these are chosen for diversity. These stations operate around the clock, 24/7, and they scan a number of fixed frequencies from 160 to 15 metres. And the idea of scanning a range of frequencies, of course, is that it can take advantage of whatever propagation exists. So there's a bit of a diagram of the South Pacific Emcomm network. We have an operator on Tuvalu who unfortunately is not very well just at the moment. And we also have an operator in Fiji who's Antoine VK, so we have Antoine in Fiji, and we also have network stations in Melbourne, and until recently we had a network station in Darwin as well. We are actually looking at the moment for another network station in Northern Australia. What sort of gear do we use? That's an example of the network station that I run. It's all commercial grade gear. I guess the reason for showing this is it's not just a transceiver parked on a shelf somewhere. It's got commercial grade power supplies and antenna tuning units. It's got a rather special Codan NGT transceiver, which has got lots of options in it, and computers and backup power supplies and backup generators for the power supplies and what have you. So the whole thing is designed to be very reliable. And all the network stations are time synced back to GPS, and any of the field stations can synchronize their clocks back to them if need be. And this system runs 24/7, 365. So has this system been of use? Well, yes, it has. Now, Antoine 3D2AG normally resides in Fiji, but he was visiting Rotuma over Christmas and New Year. Now, Antoine is also a very well-known DX operator and operates on FT8 on quite a number of bands. So when he travels anywhere around the Pacific, he takes his gear with him, and he's constantly hunted by the DX operators. Now, he was on Rotuma, which has a population of about 1,600 people, so it's only a small island. Very little phone contact, and he had no internet, but he became aware of a tropical storm nearby, which was causing some concern. And there was a possible cyclone warning. So he sent us this. And this is one of our data maps. Just see if I can wake up the cursor, where there it is. So that's the message in the middle there that came back from Rotuma back to us, asking us to help him out with some weather forecast, which he then wanted to pass on to the other people on the island so they knew what to expect as the cyclone was forming nearby. So we helped as best we could. We stood up another high power network station. In due course, the storm did develop and became Tropical Cyclone Sarai, which happened to pass around the south area, or south of Rotuma. We were mainly using 20 meters for this. For the next 7 days or so, we were sending detailed weather data back to Rotuma so that they had the latest available forecast from the Fiji Met Bureau, and that was happening up to every 2 hours. And then Antoine was passing that information on to others on the island. Now, as it happened, and Tropical Cyclone Sarai passed Rotuma and headed towards Fiji. It ended up going around the southwest corner of Fiji as well. And Antoine was very happy. That's his thanks back to us, which arrived on the 3rd of January this year. But then, unfortunately, as I alluded at the bottom of the last slide, a tragedy happened. And what happened was that, unfortunately, Antoine's young son drowned at Rotuma. And because Antoine was very busy with DXing and what have you, of course, he needed to let the rest of the world know that that was the end of the DXing. So that information itself also came through our system via email. was sent to some of the DX pages on the net operating out of the US. So that was an extremely sad thing to happen for Antoine and for everybody concerned. Now, this system has developed quite a bit of interest. It's been the subject of 2 IRU papers, that's the International Amateur Radio Union papers. And we actually have one of the authors of that paper with us tonight, is Peter VK3MV. First one was in Ho Chi Minh cities in 2013, and that looked at some of the history of the Emcomm Net, Recom and what have you. And then there was another paper presented to the conference in Seoul in Korea in 2017, and that was talking about the Pacific Islands system that we've been developing for a little while. Incidentally, I sit across both the Emcomm and the WICEN organisations. And finally, I'm not going to go through all this slide because it's far too detailed. But this is to illustrate the sort of analysis that you need to do on your radio system if you want to use it for emergency systems. So across the top here, we have robustness. Robustness is, will the system keep going even when conditions are poor? Security, which basically means encryption. Accuracy, can you be absolutely certain that whatever you put in one end of your radio system appears out the other end, and immediately somebody says use voice, you have no accuracy. Throughput is another key requirement. So how fast can you push data through the system? Is it flexible? Can it handle any sort of file, or are there limits on it? Is it auditable in case of questions being asked later on? And we have to be constantly aware that because we're handling messages on behalf of other people, it is quite possible that there could be an inquiry or a royal commission or a coroner or anybody like that looking at our messaging system. And then deployability, how easy is it to set up a system like this, and relative cost. And in case you're wondering, PACTOR is quite costly, but there are ways around that. We certainly don't ask our operators to pay for their PACTOR modems. And then the modes we looked at were, first of all, HF and VHF, UHF voice, and voice plus phone patch. Digital modes, VHF packet unencrypted, VHF packet encrypted, and using WinLink 2000 using RMS. HF packet, which doesn't do terribly well. WinLink 2000 using Winmore. Now Winmore is a bit out of date now, it's shortly to be shut down. WinLink with PACTOR, the Emcomm Win system, and other digital modes. And the coding I've got there is bright green means it's very good or excellent, pale green is good, yellow is fair, and pink is poor. And when you see it like that, you can see why the Recom guys and Emcomm guys ended up choosing and developing the system they did, because it really does tick all the boxes. Well, that's about it from me. You've probably got tired of hearing my voice by now. So I will hand it over to Chris, and we'll take any questions at the end of Chris's presentation.
Thanks very much, John and Mark. Just while I'm seeing if I can maximise my screen here. Okay, hope you can see that on full screen now. Yep, thumbs up from someone. Yeah, yep. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah. Well, good evening all, and just a little bit of background myself. I've had a licensed amateur call sign since the early 80s and been in WICEN since about the mid, I think 85, 86. So when I think about that, I thought it was 24 years, but I think it's closer to 34 years, which seems staggering. Anyway, let's have a look at an exercise that we ran locally here, and see how that sort of panned out and what it might mean for others looking at doing things in their community. So, as Mark said, WICEN hasn't been used at state level for years, and even in this last horrific bushfire season over summer, WICEN Victoria wasn't used because we weren't needed. As far as we can tell, we certainly had a presence frequently with hookups and regional emergency management team meetings in Gippsland, which were daily or every third day or weekly sort of towards the end. So it wasn't like we were invisible, but we just weren't needed. Anyway, look, maybe a little bit more of that later. What could WICEN do at the local level in your local community? Well, that's what hopefully we'll give some insight to tonight. And we've found that having membership in the local emergency local emergency management organisations or teams, committees, is a really good way of meeting other people in the emergency agencies, but also finding out what sorts of things we might be able to do. So it's whilst we're not overly active there in terms of calling the shots or anything like that, we pick up a fair bit of information. So yeah, we've got a seat on the regional emergency management team, so that's the Gippsland, when I say regional, and also on a number of the municipal emergency management planning committees in Gippsland. We're on at least 3 of those and have had representation on a number of others, but just not at the moment. Those municipal emergency management planning, just by way of background, because some wouldn't know probably, that involves the identification and documentation of the overall multi-agency arrangements in place for the prevention of and response to and recovery from emergencies that affect the municipal district. Now, newer technologies such as NBN and smarter comm systems, quite different to the systems of old. Like you take the old telephone system with the exchange with a battery bank and copper in the ground. Very different these days. Not many people would have the old system still. So when the power went off at home, there's just a simple case, your telephone still worked. But, of course, that may not be the case now if you've relying on a mobile phone with you need power to charge it, or you've got a some other portable phone that needs power to run on the system, or you might be using voice over internet, and internet won't necessarily go with a power outage. So yeah, times have changed and will continue to change. Just looking at the Gippsland local government areas, or LGAs, in fact, right across the state, there's nearly 80 LGAs across the state, and the Gippsland ones, which I've circled in red there, there's 6 of those in our area. So we start in the west with Bass Coast, so that includes Phillip Island, and main town is Wonthaggi. South Gippsland main area would be Leongatha in there, and you've got the Prom. Baw Baw's got Drew and Warrigal, and goes up into the mountains. Latrobe, which is where John and I both live. We've got the main towns of Moe, Morwell and Traralgon, and we've got heavy industry down here with power generation and paper mills as examples. Moving east, we've got a very large one, Wellington, which goes right up into the Great Divide as well, and main towns there would be Sale and Yarram, and East Gippsland is even bigger. It includes the likes of Beansdale, Lakes Entrance, Omeo, and Orbost, and right across to Malakuta in the far east. And of course, everyone's heard a lot about Malakuta during the current fire season. Yeah, okay, so moving on. Exercise guiding principles. So we wanted to, it was WICEN's idea to come up with an exercise to involve at least one and hopefully more municipalities. So we want to make a, in an effort to sell something to them, want to make a plausible scenario, something that would actually grab their attention. We want to keep it simple and not involve too many groups. This is the first one of these we've done, and we plan to do some more of them. We were sort of thwarted late last year because the fire season started in about August, I think. So we really were wiped out of possibilities for running something in the second half of the year. We could have involved police or CFA or SES or all of those and other groups, but we want to keep it simple. So that's how we, that was the concept anyway. And we thought we'd let the LGAs dictate the key arrangements so that we would just follow, and that would be easier for them in that case. In Gippsland, the LGAs seem to sharpen their emergency focus, and I guess this applies all around the state, particularly over the fire season, but also in the storm and flood season, which is sort of shoulders the fire season, if not some overlap. And the LGAs we've found tend to have quite a high turnover of staff who are called upon with sort of secondary roles to have some emergency management responsibilities. Maybe the top people don't change that often, but that does happen too. So they were actually fairly keen to have their new people exposed to some emergency management training. So that sort of worked in our favour. And we want to run an exercise both as a demonstration for them and as a training event for ourselves, as well as them, of course. And I think I forgot to say earlier, but it might have been on the slide, from looking at some notes here at the same time, which don't follow the slides necessarily, that we did get some interest from the LGAs. We sort of bounced the idea off them, and that there was some appetite there, so that allowed us to proceed. Anyway, the background scenario we came up with was a widespread failure of the electricity grid. So when we think of grid, and you might think of a road system with gridlock across the CBD or something, the grid is an intermeshed system, that's how you might think of it. And the electricity grid in large connected places like Europe certainly is a grid. In Victoria and other places in Australia, a grid's not always a grid. There's often long radial lines, transmission lines. So you only have to sort of break those, and everyone downstream is off the air. And as I alluded to earlier, our society today is much more reliant on electricity for telecommunications of all sorts, including internet, and even things like just listening to the ABC for emergency broadcasts when the action's really happening. So in our local area, just here in Latrobe Valley and wider or further into Gippsland, I can think of at least 4 instances over the last not too many years where there's been widespread failures. Just briefly, over this last summer, of course, the power lines to East Gippsland were severed just not far out of Bairnsdale, to the east of Bairnsdale. Or between there and Orbost. So the supply to the whole of East Gippsland, from there on was lost, and that was out of action for a number of weeks. Another time, damaged optic fibre link took off emergency communications to the likes of VicPol, Ambulance Victoria, and some CFA radio systems over much of Gippsland. So, that's your emergency services without their normal comms. Sure, they still have local sort of simplex contact, but that's not how they dispatch jobs or talk over any real distance. Another occasion of fire at a major radio site in the heart of the valley here took some equipment out, and that produced widespread failure of radio comms as well for emergency services. And on another occasion, they were testing an emergency generator at a key installation. And I don't just mean one on the mountaintop somewhere, this was a key one. and it took out, something went wrong, it took out radio comms and other telecoms. So these things can and do happen. Anyway, back to the Exercise Magpie. We've said there's going to be a widespread failure of the electricity grid, and therefore there's no power, no telephone and no internet. So that achieved the aim of getting their ears pricked up and getting some interest. And yeah, they want to have a look at that for sure. So just a general concept, here's a Google map showing part of Gippsland, and it's just sort of very diagrammatic, but general concept was to provide some comms between the two shires who said, yes, we'll do this. So Baw Baw Shire, which is around Druin Warrigal area, and to the city of Latrobe, which is, as I said, around Moe Mall, Traralgon area. So that was the general idea there. And sort of by the way, a lot of shires have a memorandum of understanding, sort of inter-shire agreement, where they'll be happy to let the neighbouring shires or other shires in the region use their resources. So the shires actually want to do this, and they want to practice this too. Some events, of course, may affect multiple shires simultaneously. So what were the objectives of the exercise? It was important to actually formulate and state these. So the first one was to demonstrate the ability to establish and operate independent communications between Latrobe City and Baw Baw Shire. And then number two, within each shire or local government area, establish a separate communications link between the nominated municipal emergency control centre and the remote location where a relief centre would be established. And that remote location could be anywhere. So we let the shires decide where these places would physically be. The third objective was to test the interface between the shires and any other participating organisations and WICEN. So this is just how do the WICEN people interact with the shire and vice versa, you know, in those individual locations. Because that's not something we've practiced or even got a procedure for, really. And as an addendum or sort of a add-on to the exercise, another organisation, actually I forget who instigated it, anyway, either one of the shires or DHHS asked if we could at the same time test the sat phones. So WICEN facilitated a test between 6 sat phones. So we didn't actually get involved apart from saying, okay guys, away you go, you ring that one and that one ring another one, whatever. So that was the fourth objective. So those objectives were signed off with each shire, which was good. So the broad comms plan, just expanding a bit on what I said before, in local government area number 1, so this would be Baw Baw, for example, at their control centre, comms between that and the other shires over a backbone of comms. And then within each shire, we've got local comms down to a relief centre in each one. So pretty simple, but yeah, that provides a number of interfaces to get going and need a few operators to set that up and to operate it. So the nominated locations, this is a another Google map, thanks Google, showing the valley area or Gippsland area. This is West Gippsland, from Druin through Warrigal, Trafalgar, Moe, Mall and Traralgon. And you can see the terrain. This is the sort of the lower slopes of the Great Divide here, and this is Latrobe Valley proper with this nice green area straight through, and we've got the Stress-Lecky ranges here and other ranges over here. So quite hilly to the south of that fairly narrow valley, and that does affect the radio signals. So Baw Baw Shire sort of centred around Druin. In fact, their head office is in council chambers are in Druin. They would ordinarily set up at their one of their conference rooms in Druin there. So that's what we were advised. Latrobe City's Municipal Emergency Command Centre is ordinarily in Traralgon, in their offices in Traralgon. But they knew there was some refurbishment work about to start or happening, so they said we'll use our alternate mech, and that's located at Latrobe Regional Airport, which is operated by the Shire anyway. They've got quite a large sort of departure and arrival lounge, which is scarcely used. So yeah, that's where they set up there. And relief centres were designated at the Warrigal Sports Centre, which is quite a large building, and the Shire, of course, runs that. So that was that location. And in Morwell, Latrobe City wanted to set up their relief centre at a place called Kernot Hall, which is just right in Morwell, and it's a large hall area too, which could provide relief for many hundreds of people. In fact, it has. And then just with a few days to go, Baw Baw said, no, we're not going to use Druid. We're going to use our Alternus mech, which is in the old council chambers in Trafalgar, when that used to be a different shire. So, okay, that's fine. We'll go there and have a look and set things up there. Trafalgar, though, sort of raised a few question marks, because Trafalgar is whether you're driving a car and listening to Melbourne radio or whatever, or trying to operate VHF or UHF around Trafalgar, it's a known black hole. Or if it's not a black hole, it's a lot of phase distortion. It's just right in that spot that's not good for RF. Anyway, more on that coming. And the blue spot here is we had the opportunity to set up a crossband repeater in the hills just south of Moe, with the hope of bridging a bit of distance there. All right, so moving along, the actual communications plane that we drew up, just a little bit more data, but it's exactly the same topology as you saw before. We've got the Baw Baw mech, and they actually use different terminology. This is something you strike when you work with different organisations, but instead of MECC, which is like standard across the rest of Victoria, I think, Municipal Emergency Control Centre or Command Centre, Baw Baw just use MEC. Anyway, between Baw Baw and Latrobe, we've got John's HF data backbone on HF using the Emcomm system. And then we've got in Latrobe a simplex link that's only about less than 10 kilometres from that building across to the hall for the relief centre. So that was just on a WICEN simplex frequency. And this was a bit trickier going from Baw Baw to from Trafalgar back to the Warrigal Sports Centre. We had a couple of options there, but ended up relying on a existing but infrequently used UHF repeater up in those hills to the south. And we also set up a liaison from where I was. I was controlling the exercise. I was here in Morwell at the airport, and I wanted to talk to the guys over here, sort of separate to John's system. So I had a crossband repeater up on a hill in the middle, and we used that, and we also actually used that to get into this other repeater. And the tests we did on that the day before worked fine. On the day though, Murphy struck and the propagation changed quickly and quite a lot. So it was a bit patchy, but we had a backup plan and used that and that worked. So it's another tick for the planning process, I guess, isn't it? So that was the essence of the planning for us. And there's a photo, the photo here is actually from the exercise, just showing, well, you can see a couple of poles and antennas and a trailer full of goodies to help set stuff up. We were set up inside and we had a couple of antennas set up outside. So what were the outcomes of the exercise? Well, first of all, just sort of basically what actually happened on the day. Shire personnel generated messages on paper at either end, and very simple messages like, you know, directed to a relief centre at the other end or the one near them. Do you need more tea or sugar? Something like that. Or, you know, can such and such work another shift tomorrow night? Just simple things we're passing like that. So they would just pass the message to WICEN, you know, hand it to WICEN person who transmitted it to the other end. And similarly, messages received were logged and then passed hand by hand to the Shire personnel. The exercise ran for a little over 60 minutes. And then it, as I said, at the instigation of one of the other parties, I'll just forget exactly which one it was, we then tacked on the bit testing the satellite phones, which was nothing to do directly with us, but interesting for us to observe and facilitate. So the outcomes of the exercise, and these outcomes are tied directly to the 4 objectives I went through before. So the first one was secure data link, which is the HF Emcomm system, over which messages could be passed, was established between Baw Baw Shire's Neck in Trafalgar and Latrobe City's Neck Latrobe Regional Airport. So that was met. Number 2, a voice link was established between Baw Baw Shire's Neck in Trafalgar and the Release Centre, and similarly in Latrobe. So we set up those other 2 voice links. Third one, messages received via the radio systems were successfully passed to the Shire personnel and received from the Shire personnel before being transmitted. And WICEN used a paper-based system at each end. And finally, number 4 was the sat phones. They were tested and that was all good. So what happened next? Well, we asked for feedback. So we got feedback from both Shires and DHHS, and feedback from the personnel from WICEN. Everyone provided feedback, which was good. So there was a lot of feedback, and I've condensed all that into sort of the key and relevant points, and we actually sent some sort of summarised feedback to the Shires, or including all the relevant stuff for them, but much more detailed feedback to our own WICEN members involved in exercise and WICEN Victoria generally. So, yeah, both Shires welcomed the opportunity, and we, of course, welcomed the chance to work with the Shires. Messages were simple. This one came back from the, I think, Latrobe City, and they said something quite relevant, that for an unplanned event, we may not have easy access to, getting our equipment set up so easily, and, it is hard sometimes to run coax outside, so we really have to wing it. But, as Mark said earlier, we need to be resourceful in what we do. The Shires thought that having a scribe alongside the radio ops would be useful. Well, we do actually do that with larger events if we've got the personnel to do it. And the Shire staff weren't familiar with WICEN's paper-based system, but they very soon got the hang of it, so that was no drama. One of the Shire suggested that VicPol should have been there to see the WICEN setup. Yeah, they could have been. But we want to keep it simple on this occasion. So maybe next time, if we repeat this one, we'll think about that. Use of in and out trays, well, we do that too, actually, on bigger exercises or real events. So that's something the Shire picked up. WICEN actually had to address on the day, and this was highly unusual, which sounds like a bit of a, I'll try and dismiss it, but we did have a highly unusual number of technical issues on the day, and John seemed to be at the centre of discovering some of those, but also fixing all of them. So resourcefulness, knowing how your equipment is meant to work, having alternatives is good. So yeah, we got through all those, and whilst it probably caused some short delays, we still got the messages passed and the exercise was successful. And I wasn't trying to say John's gear was no good, it was very good, but just things that, like an automatic Windows update causing something else to happen, something you didn't expect or whatever. So anyway, got through all these little hookups. And the sat phones worked, as I said. The operators did have to go outside though, so it makes you wonder with sat phones if organisations were trying to receive a call on a sat phone but didn't know a call was coming and they're working inside, they're not going to have their phone ring unless they've got an external antenna, more than likely. So sat phones do have, it seems, some quite high risk limitations on them. And the final bit of feedback was we were asked, how do we contact WICEN? If they can't get on to me, being the local coordinator, or John, who's like a deputy, how do we get onto WICEN? How do they contact WICEN Victoria, for example? So I thought that was a really positive sign that they asked that, because it means they, you know, got a bit more, they've thought some more about using WICEN. So anyway, we were able to answer that question by return email and give them the state contact number. So, conclusion for the exercise, a successful local government area comms exercise was planned and run. Got good feedback, useful learnings for all parties, benefits to all parties, and we plan to offer similar exercises between other local government areas, and even the same ones again. The Baw Baw and Latrobe suggest we run another one in 2 years' time. So we'll certainly be following that up. As I said, we were thwarted last summer with too many fires to people to even think about training exercises. So just a bit now to point things in the Bendigo direction. Maybe the scope for inter-LTA comms in your own area around Bendigo. So just to home in on the Bendigo Shire, a lot of people mightn't know what that actually covers. I think it's called the Greater Bendigo City, I think it might be called. Yeah, so that's what it covers. So that's where Greater Bendigo fits into the surrounding shires, and I think Neil mentioned in his introduction Loddon and Campaspe up to the north, and you've got others around there. Now, as it turns out, Bendigo and 4 surrounding shires, which I've underlined there, actually form the Northern Victorian Emergency Management Cluster. So they've got formal arrangements in place, recognised and supported by EMV, and there is actually a Northern Victorian Integrated Emergency Management Plan. And I don't know if I'm telling you things you Bendigo guys already know or not, but I just didn't take much searching yesterday to find info on the web about that. So that plan addresses the prevention and mitigation of and response to recovery from emergencies within the municipal boundaries of those 5 participating councils. So just to pose a question, open question at this stage, how would these shires communicate during an emergency if there was a prolonged power outage? Would they rely purely on sat phones? Sat phones saved the day last summer in many isolated rural communities in East Gippsland. They were dropped in by helicopter. And in the past, if you think back, 10, 15 years, sat phones weren't that common, and WICEN would have been maybe the next port of call. But in these fires, sat phones probably stopped WICEN, although WICEN couldn't have got into those things because of roadblocks, but there may have been a number of other things WICEN could have done. Anyway, maybe food for thought there with the cluster and the emergency management plans around Bendigo. I just probably reinforce what Mark said. Let's go back to that one. What Mark said about the local club, the radio club, providing the members for WICEN. Don't have to go through the radio club, but that's probably typically in, I'm guessing, rural areas, and certainly down here where the members come from, but it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have a separate WICEN organisation, Gippsland. We tend to, without our local radio club, there's a few WICEN members there. We use that as a forum to advertise local events, and occasionally we're looking for additional operators. A lot of guys like going up to a community event and helping. So yeah, we draw on resources from other than WICEN to do that sometimes if we can't get enough WICEN members. Anyway, that's probably about where I want to leave it. Just finish up with these 3 photos. The top one's there at a major car rally, sort of at state level in Gippsland, and that's the WICEN operating area there, looking after logistics and scoring and some safety traffic as well. The picture below with the rather sulky looking one was taken down out north of Bairnsdale somewhere on the Alpine Rally a year or so ago at a checkpoint on the, or sorry, a finish control, I think it was, on the rally. And just by way of interest, the Alpine Rally is the longest running car rally, I think, anywhere in the world. It's coming up to its 100th year next time. So that will be a big one. And the other picture is of a WICEN briefing on the night before the Mallee Rally, which is run up around Lake Tyrrell in the Mallee, sort of around the campfire and under a starry sky. So that's me done. Thank you very much. Back to you, Neil, I guess.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Hello, I'm not registering. Can anybody hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay. All right. But it's not lighting up around the picture like it normally is. Well, firstly, on behalf of everyone, thank you, Chris, John, and Mark, for your efforts this evening. This has been a very informative session, giving us a number of different perspectives on WICEN's operations and what kind of contribution Barrick might be able to make in the event of emergency in Loddon Campaspe. There is quite a lot of information for us to sift through, quite a lot to digest. Look, I'm not going to comment any further than I'm going to revisit the video with this so that I can go through the information at my leisure and digest it a bit more properly. Graham, do you have any comments that you'd like to add at this point?
We could probably, I guess, open it up for questions. First of all, yeah, thank you very much to the presenters this evening. Very, very interesting, and yeah, certainly a lot of food for thought for how Barrick could become involved somehow. But I've got a question in regards to Emcomm and encryption.
Just before you do, sorry, Graham, could I just interject for one moment? Yeah. One thing I forgot to mention, and if you're interested in what it can really be like in a SHTF situation, if you look up the call sign November Sierra 0 Sierra, November Sierra 0 Sierra, or NSOS on QRZ, you will find links to his Google Docs. Now, Jeremy Doherty is a career firefighter, EMT, soldier, and quite a well-rounded radio operator. He was deployed with about 20 other operators to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017 in September. And there's also about a 2-hour interview with Jeremy and one of the other operators on YouTube on the Ham Radio Now Emcomm Extra Edition number 18. Jeremy has produced a document that's called Guide to Extreme Emcomm. Jeremy goes into great detail about how, when he was deployed as part of an ARRL contingent, about some of the issues of, how do I put it, different perspectives. We hear often things in the media about certain aspects of ham radio. You just can't turn up with your Bofang and think you're going to save the day in 2020 and beyond. Jeremy talks about a lot of the issues around WinLink. WinLink was used, but WinLink was used in telnet mode, which is the internet mode. So he discusses how a WinLink failed as a HF device. He also talks about some of the issues of working in an Emcomm environment. So it's a really good, if you want to call it study, a real world scenario that's worth having the read, because if anyone thinks it's going to be easy, then have a read of and have a listen to Jeremy speak. Back to you there, Graham. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. Some good information there. Just a question for me in regards to Emcomm and encryption. How do we go in regards to legislation prohibiting amateur radio network from encryption and that sort of thing? That might be a question for John.
Yeah, no worries. The simple answer is encryption is allowed, is specifically allowed in the LCD for emergency communications and for training for emergency communications. So there is no problem with the regulations. In fact, we are very fortunate that we have that. For some strange reason, when the FCC asked the ARRL if they were interested in encryption, the answer was a resounding no. And of course, that severely limits what the ARRL and their people like racers and what have you can transmit over radio, because anybody can intercept it. And I believe that is a really important attribute of emergency communication. It must be secure.
Yeah, thanks for answering that, John. Thank you.
Graham, I've got a question for Chris.
Yeah, go ahead.
Chris, I noted that you shared the facilities at Latrobe with the airport. I presume that the frequencies that you'd plan to use for the operation have been cleared with ACMA. Did you have any problems with having an aircraft band installation so close to where you were operating?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Mike, is it?
Yep.
Yeah. No, we didn't. We got permission from the airport manager to do that, and said what we'd be doing, where we'd be putting stuff, and there was no problem. They have a CTAF, Common Traffic Area Frequency, I think it stands for, at the airport, and that's almost invariably just plane to plane or back to the Aero Club. There's no control tower there. It's even though it's a regional airport, it's fairly light on for sort of major infrastructure. So short answer is no problem.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Sorry. Go.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, any other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Heidi.
This is radio unrelated and Wilson unrelated. But John, are you a Latrobe Valley born and bred basically person?
No, I'm not actually. I grew up in East Gippsland and then moved down to Melbourne to go through university and do engineering and all that sort of stupid thing. But I've been in
Wasn't
the...
Thorpedale or Narracan or something, was it?
Sorry?
You're not a Melbourne North High School boy, are you?
No, I'm not. No, further east than that.
No, I came from Ballara.
Oh, right.
And I went to Melbourne North High School, and I'm sure I went to school with a Morrisey up there, a girl. But yeah, I'm not sure.
I believe there was a Morrisey family in this area, but they're not related to my branch of the family as far as I know.
Okay, sorry to interrupt there, but yeah, it was just got me curious. Thank you. Sorry.
I have a question regarding encryption too. John, you might want to answer this one as well. I noticed that a number of the systems that were developed, they're up to, I think, 14 to 20 odd years old, something in that range. There are a number of APRS type systems, encryption systems, things like VARA.
Yes. Coming. I'm bringing it up.
There are some new systems that have been developed in recent times, John, things like VARA FM, for example. How do these are relatively straightforward to implement on local systems, or I would expect so. How do they rate as in terms of security and reliability and robustness, in your opinion? Where would something like VARA FM appear on your chart of ticking the boxes?
I must admit I haven't looked specifically at VARA FM. I have looked very briefly at VARA on HF, which is one of the alternatives to RDOP on Winley. I haven't been able to find very much information about how well it actually works. For example, I do have very good information on how well Packdoor works. I have good information on how the old Winmore system worked, which wasn't terribly well. But I haven't been able to track down much of the detail of RDOP and VARA at this stage. I must admit it is an interest of mine to find out what's going on. But of course, I guess the other point to make is that these are all modulation schemes. The encryption system is quite separate to the modulation scheme. So modulation scheme is how the data or whatever is encoded onto the radio signal. In the Emcomm Win case, the encryption was developed many years ago now, but it is a rolling code system. I must admit I don't understand very much about it, but I'm assured by the mathematician who developed it that it is quite secure. Of course, one of the other issues with encryption is it's a bit like having locks on your door. That locks only keep out honest people, and the whole objective of any encryption is simply to make it hard for somebody to listen in on what you're sending, but put enough horsepower into it and almost any encryption is breakable.
Right.
Yeah, was that Peter VK3PLD? You have a question?
Yeah, look, I've got a very basic question. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for the presentation. I think it was excellent this evening. Absolutely enjoyed it. It's a very basic question. I've had a bit of interest in you guys for a little time and wanted to get involved and join. I got online and found some contacts to do that and wrote and showed my interest in doing that. Have not had a response. Also noticed that on your Facebook and website pages, they seem to be years old, so they're very out of date. Am I not looking in the right place? Are you not looking for more involvement from others, or how do I get in touch with you? Do you want my services is what I'm saying.
Do you want me to answer that one, John?
Probably a good idea, Mark, seeing you're on the comm. How's that for a head pass?
I could answer it in a couple of different ways, and I think like any organisation, whether it's your local soccer club, school committee or whatever, often you find there's always gaps. And I know over the last probably 8 months, I've come across your question on more than one occasion, Peter. Can you just drop me an email at hudo@optushome.com.au, hudo@optushome.com.au, and we'll take care of that, Peter.
Okay, got that. Thank you very much for that. And if you need someone to look after your website, I can do that for you as well.
Well, you probably notice I do all the blogging because I'm fortunate that my wife is an author, so she can do all my spell checking because I'm not a very good speller. But we've probably over the last I think couple of years got our blog a little bit more frequent with the events we do. But it's one of the things some of our you guys do a lot better job at your media advertising and so forth than what we do, so we could probably learn something from you guys, and that's also a little bit about what we're doing tonight, because
Thanks, Brian.
WICEN isn't a club, it's an organization, and I guess our role is to provide those communications to the community when there's that STHF situation. So there's a lot of things that we can learn from clubs like yours, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I make a comment?
Go ahead, Tony.
Thanks. Yes, I'd like to thank everybody. Very interesting. I've learned a lot about WICEN, a lot more positive things. What I have got a query about is it seems to be always, everybody talks about organisation to organisation communications. Well, there's another area that I'm interested in. I've got some friends who live in the Friars Forest community, which is about a dozen houses at the end of a bush track from a very remote location. They're all in their local CFA because they have to be. They're actually looking after themselves, but they use CBs to communicate between them all. Neil and I went there to visit, and we got approached to train a couple of the members there in amateur radio because they can't get out of their area with CB radio, and we had them how they use shortwave and VHF to the local repeater. We actually had a great contact out of the area. But to my mind, the big weakness here is the communication between the person stuck in a terrible situation and the 000. They're missing that link out. And sat phones dropped down a great answer once people know about them. But prior to that, I think I'm trying to help them look after themselves. But what do you guys think about that?
Well, I might just jump on that one first and then let John or Chris have a crack at that. I think, Tony, you have to take responsibility for your own actions. You take responsibility for where you choose to live and your family, and you do what you need to do to look after yourself. Now, whether that's CB radio or getting an amateur radio license or having the financial ability to own your own sat phone, you do what you need to do. I do a lot of hiking, and I always, like Chris does, and we both carry satellite communicators with us, as well as your handheld and radio equipment. So I think you do what you need to do, and if they need to be amateur radio operators to get messages out, to get the ball rolling, to get help, then great.
But do you think there's a role for WICEN to train these people, or to talk about WICEN's role to be not just into organisation, but from public to organisation, should I say?
I think if there's an opportunity to speak to people, absolutely yes. One of the challenges is, as Chris alluded to, a lot of the people in various shires change roles frequently. There is a position in a shire, and Chris will correct me if I'm wrong, and it's called the EMLO, the Emergency Management Liaison Officer. I think I've got that right. And in fact, through my studies recently, I noticed there was a lady up in the shire further on than Bendigo that borders the Victorian-New South Wales border. I can't remember the shire. But by day, she's the collections officer, but her role is also an EMLO, and she has no idea what really that role is, and certainly in the bigger scheme, and most likely she'll do that for 12 months and someone else will do it. So finding those people within the shires that want to give you the time so you can go and speak to them and find out maybe those micro needs in those communities can prove to be a challenge. But certainly, if there's ever any opportunity for WICEN or WICEN to be involved with a radio club to help or train or support the community with regards to emergency communications, we'd be more than happy to. John or Chris, have you got anything else to add to that?
Yeah, you go, Chris.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, Tony, WICEN members certainly never want to put themselves in danger. So, we're certainly not going to go into or be asked to go into a dangerous area to provide comms. And going back to basics, if people live in a high-risk area, that like I do, our fire plan here says do not stay on the property on the top 2 fire danger rating days, and on the third highest one, assess it depending on other things, so we wouldn't be here. But whether WICEN can offer advice on, radios to get, well, that would be only informal advice, I would think. But John, you've had some close experience with these sorts of situations. You might want to add to that.
Yeah, I think I understand the sort of network you've got running there, Tony, because I know of several similar networks operating here in Gippsland, especially in some of the more remote areas where, for example, the farmers have a network of CB, which then comes eventually back into the nearest town. And that's a great idea. I know of several networks like that in Gippsland, where people have basically got together and established their own network precisely for emergency communications. I guess from WICEN point of view, we're not in a position to be able to offer that service to anybody who needs it, of course. But some time ago, Chris and I can remember, we had discussions with the local police inspector about some specific isolated areas or townships that we knew of in Gippsland and where these CB systems existed. And one of the options that we did discuss with VicPol was the ability to interface one of these CB networks with WICEN networks to provide long distance communication out of the area. And one of the things they were particularly worried about, or the VicPol was worried about, was the ability to access 000. So yeah, that's quite an important point that you make.
Thanks for your answer. That was great.
Yeah, can I just also add to that, and particularly what Tony Feller was saying as well? Actually, I also, amongst others too, I made a submission to the Royal Commission, and I mean, as Maurice Stanford would know, I was a communications planner for DELP for a number of years, and it seemed to me where the hole is communities with requiring communications plans in communities. And just as you have a fire plan and other plans in emergency, communities also need communications plan. Also, there's more awareness that needs to be out there in regards to people knowing that there's alternative communications facilities available, like amateur radio or HF system, things like that. There's a lack of awareness these days, unfortunately, when all the systems are down or congested. So yeah, that's one thing that we can't do it all. Amateurs can't do it all. WICEN can't do it all. But there needs to be more overall awareness that communities need to know or be aware that alternative systems can be put in place and to have a communications plan. So that's just something that I'd like to add.
And just further to that, Graham, membership of your local municipal emergency management plan committee gets you across some of those things, because on our committee in Latrobe, we actually have reps from a couple of local community groups who are, the more out of towners. So yeah, another reason to perhaps think about the MEMPCs, through an organisation like WICEN, perhaps.
Could I jump in there, DPW?
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just on the point raised before about CVs and such, during the 2009 fires, WICEN had a big presence, and up in the Alexandra area, I was stationed at the MEC and the ICC on separate occasions. The first few days of the disaster, we moved in on the Monday, and we were doing fire alert messages. We were retransmitting the fire alert messages on HF, and yeah, okay, that was interesting on the amateur bands. It wasn't for general consumption, I suppose. Then there was a lot of building panic around the township of Alexandra. And the police approached us to see if we could get these alert messages out on the UHF CV system, which we, of course, did straight away, and managed to calm things a lot in the community. A lot of the outlying farm houses or farms were cut off, no power, battery, etc. And they all communicated with UHF CB, and they were you know, we were able to keep them up to date with what was happening, which fitted in quite well with the comment before.
Yes, thank you, Paul. That's answered some questions I've had.
Any other questions?
Can I ask a question? VK3FNQS here.
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah. Actually, just quickly for Tony, and to give you another idea, there's a group actually called up here in Cheshunt, in the King Valley. To give you an example, they set up, their community have set up their own repeater because of a boy who drowned in the King River. There was, up in the upper King River, there's no CFA and police. So one of the conditions is that if there's an emergency that's happening, the police or the CFA have got access to patch into the system at Wangaratta via the Cheshunt repeater, which I can actually get here in Chichura pretty strong, seeing it's 1,000 metres up. So there is a group that maybe might be for that group to maybe look at. They're very welcoming and so forth. I'm happy to send it through the details to you there, Tony, via email for you, so you've got those details and the contacts and so forth for you. Sorry, continuing on. My question is to the guys in Gippsland. I'm from Pakenham, so I actually remember going to WICEN meetings with my grandfather back at the Pakenham Shire Hall, or the old Cardinia Shire Hall, with who's my grandfather being VK3DQS Bill. So my question is, with the local governments and so forth, what, seeing that you're on the edge with the Baw Baw and Bass Coast, how logistically is it to going to Cardinia, or I'm trying to think what's further north that's outside those areas, and using, so like a setup point for Cardinia to Baw Baw instead of within that area? Is there much more logistically working because you're crossing the boundary of WICEN with the actual area? Yeah, I just sort of was wondering, what would that be? Would it be more logistically wise, more work crossing that border?
Yeah, I'll try to field that one. Thanks for the question, Jason. Short answer is no, I don't think so. We don't need to seek permission from shires to be on their land or to set up gear in their area, as far as I know. So, and particularly in an emergency, you do whatever is needed to make things work. So I don't know if John or Mark wish to add anything to that.
Could I jump in there, Chris? DPW. Yeah, one of the shires in my area, I'm the region coordinator, Central Southern Metropolitan Region, which includes Cardinia. And a couple of years ago, the MEMP asked me to set up a communications plan for their outlying townships in the ranges. And I suppose Maryknoll is the one that's closest to the border, I would imagine, Chris. But Gembrook and other places like that. So that the Shire was right into, into trying to connect their outlying places back to the Shire office. And it was quite doable, apart from one that was particularly bad. anyway, that didn't get off the ground very far. They decided to put their money elsewhere, and so it's a plan, and it can be put into action. And that's a lot about what we do. We plan for eventualities. Back to you, Chris.
Oh, no, thanks, Paul. Yeah, of course, it's your area, but I was just answering the question in general with, going into neighbouring areas to, put a temporary comms link in or something like that, I guess. Been plenty of that done, I guess, over the years. Anyway, that's all I can think of.
I've sort of got a general question for the presenters this evening. What I'm, what I'm hearing as a general principle, and I'll just throw this one in your direction, Mark, is that following on from your comment about being responsible for your own actions and adapting to your own circumstances, would you agree that the role of an amateur radio club in an emergency situation, it would be to interact at a local level using the resources available to it and helping the community coordinate its own communications? Would that be a fair statement based on everything that we've heard this evening?
Thanks, Neil. My opinion is unless you're integrated with the local community, and I'm talking about the councils, the shires, the municipalities, yep, and you're part of an agreed plan, when a disaster happens, those overarching agencies such as police, you won't be allowed to participate. That's and I find that just with my day-to-day work. There may be a lot of good intentions from people, but unless you're part of the plan, you won't be allowed to play in the sand pit. Is that
right? Yeah, I understand. Yeah, but
just and I often drop a phrase that, and I hope people don't take offence to it. It's not meant to be offensive. It's just meant to challenge. Is you just can't rock up with your bofang and say, we can geek out with some stuff and help you.
Yeah, so just won't allow, for an integrated approach which uses the expertise of the radio club to support the community.
Correct, and that's why the work that Chris and John have done down in the Gippsland area, it's a very interwoven, integrated approach to the local communities, and they're part of the plan, as opposed to, sure, if VicPol activated WICEN and said you need to go there and do X, Y, Z. That's one thing, but I think a local club turning up on the day, there would be too much chaos and too much going on.
It's going to be getting under everybody's feet.
Be told to get away and don't interfere. You'd be seen as being interfering as opposed to good intentions. So I think early planning and integration with the locals' shire has been written into their plans. Is extremely important. Chris and John, would you agree with that? John, you?
Oh, I think it's absolutely vital that you're involved. And actually, there are two big challenges that are heading our way in the emergency management sphere. One of them is dealing with walk-up volunteers, and all agencies struggle with this issue at the moment. And I think it's getting worse as the requirements on responders and certification and competency and fitness for work and all of those sort of things are becoming more onerous. So that's one of the issues that's happening. The other thing, which is sort of heading in the opposite direction, and I'm involved on a local community emergency committee here, is the concept of community resilience. And how do you develop that? And that's been a buzzword going around in emergency management Vic for probably a couple of years now, and nobody really knows what it is. But one of the things that we're starting on in our area, which is separate to WICEN, is to try and get the community thinking about, well, if there is another fire like 2009, which incidentally the fire came right through here, if there is another event like that, which there will be, what do we need to do to get the community up and running again? And that's really a much broader issue of what do we think this community resilience is, and also rebuilding community, remembering that community is not all the buildings and so forth, it's actually the network of people. And I know Mark has been quite fascinated by some of the work done by Rob Gordon. Dr. Rob Gordon is a guy who's been working for, oh golly, about 40 years in the emergency management, emergency relief, emergency recovery sphere about how people behave and how to support people in this situation. So that's another whole great big wide area that is getting a lot of attention at the moment.
Yes, John, I'm not talking about our radio club locking up and getting involved in the situation. I'm talking about assisting people to learn about communication, to learn about equipment. And in fact, it is what I am talking about is community resilience, as you describe it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the community resilience aspect, John, is really hitting the nail on the head. I think it's clear to organisations like Barrack that we would not presume to try and reinvent the wheel in terms of what WICEN has been doing, or getting involved in the CFA or VicPol or any of these things. There need to be clear lines of delineation of what it is we're doing. And as you rightly say, we would be part of a plan in which we have a predetermined role, and we would activate by invitation or by stipulation. You know, code red day, we go on alert, whatever it is, but we would be part of a wider plan. Yeah, as you say, volunteers arriving on the day are just a nuisance and an impediment to the professionals who are already on serious deployment.
Yeah, if you go and look at some of the work that Rob Gordon has done and is doing, he talks a lot about how local organisations and clubs can really play a big part in that recovery process. I guess I equate to it a little bit like, you know, the men's shed. It's you know, bringing people in, not you know, yes, they're learning about radio, but it's also about mental health and well-being, and giving people a sense of community, and the club can play a big part in that, and not just waiting for that recovery period after the response phase, but also in the planning part of it, as you're out there working with those shires and communities, of bringing people in, and of course I think Chris or John said, well, Chris I think it was, said, you know, as part of that fire plan of getting out, and I think once you get involved with communications as well, you also start to understand the limitations. So if you listen to some of the rhetoric that some of the media organisations put out about you know, ham radio saving the day, and if somebody thought they could just be a ham radio operator and then they've got fantastic communications under all sorts of circumstances, I think once they get their license, get involved in the club, they're probably more prone to get out.
Mark, one of the things that as operated as amateurs, we see newspaper reports from all around the world, and we see a particular operator did so-and-so and so-and-such, and he's a local hero. Yep. But very seldom does the background information come out about what that guy is within the community, whether he's a member of emergency services or whatever. And I would bet that 9 times out of 10, a lot of these American ones we see are involved in some way or other within the community well before the incident occurs, and they're prepared for it. Just the same as what you're saying, we should be within the concept of WICEN.
Yeah, I don't like to be the what's the word, the one wearing the black hat in the room all the time when it comes to those things, but I like to look at them, and you know, for example, there's a YouTube channel I watch, I went to school in Colorado, and it's called 4x4 Recovery or something. And it's a group called the Colorado 4x4 Recovery Group. And this is a bunch of amateur guys. It's a club, and they go out and they recover four-wheel drives. And they talk about being activated by the local sheriff's office and going out and recovering these vehicles. And it's great to watch, and it's great for them. But, you know, I just couldn't imagine that sort of, a lot of that stuff going on here that we hear about what goes on in other countries. I mean, I couldn't imagine Vic Pol ringing up WICEN saying, you know, we need you to do this and this and this. Very different. So I'm always a little bit not skeptical, but yeah, I like to look at the detail when you hear often those reports, Mike.
Yep. I'm involved with another hat, and that's community radio. And of course, their relationship between Emergency Victoria and what they do for them is much tighter than amateur radio's involvement with Emergency Victoria. But it's not an easy place to get yourself into. It took our radio station months and years to go through all of the necessary to prove to Emergency Victoria that we were capable of providing the service they need us to do.
And a good example of that, Mike, is you know, a lot of questions were asked about WICEN Victoria not being used over the summer period where WICEN New South Wales were. WICEN New South Wales has a membership of about, I think it's 130. But out of that 130, only 30 of the operators are accredited for deployment with the New South Wales Volunteer Rescue Association. Now, Victoria doesn't have a Volunteer Rescue Association that, say, the likes of a WICEN could be aligned with. But it took them 3 years to get that sort of credibility through a personal relationship, I believe, and to get people accredited. Again, doing all the training, having the competency and also the fitness to work sign off. You have quite a litigious situation if you start sending operators into the field that, you know, have medical conditions. So you also have to be mindful of where you deploy people to. Now, deploying someone to an air-conditioned mech for a 4-hour shift is one thing, but sending them, you know, into somewhere where they're going to have to sleep in a swag and be self-sufficient for a week is another thing. So you also have to have that sort of detailed understanding of the people you deploy as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
Understand.
Thank you.
You've done a great job, you gentlemen. You still continue doing great work. Thank you very, very much. Greatly appreciate it. And even learning what we did tonight from you all has been great.
I've got another question, guys. Sorry, can I ask that question?
Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, another question. This is probably for Mark. Is it beneficial to have within the club a WICEN coordinator? Sort of more not
hey,
as
Jason,
on the... Yep.
Can you put your hand up for me? The answer is yes, mate. Absolutely.
But not as a part of the actual committee, but more as a go-to to the coordinator. So, like for myself, I'm not part of Bendigo. I'm part of the Shepparton Club, so that will fall into Peter Wicks. So, if there's an in need of emergency where the coordinator needs to organise it, you can do a quick ring around to get the actual group.
Well, yeah, I understand your question. Thanks, Jason. I think one of the trends, and I touched on it before, and I think the stats were from the UK over the last 3 or 4 months. Some 800 people in the UK have set their amateur licensing online. There's a a lot of people in Australia who have sat their exams online, whether it's through COVID, doing the American route thing to get, all gets a bit confusing, but they actually don't have hands-on with clubs and people. That's one thing. The other thing is we're all getting a lot busier. You know, both mum and dad's work and children go off to school and we've got studies, all this. So it's harder and harder for people to get involved with clubs, and whether that's sporting clubs or the local knitting club or the whiskey drinking club. Right, Don? Yep.
Got the address for that club?
Sorry?
You got the address for that club?
Yeah, you can get that from Don VK3SP in a little while. So I think the nature of organisations like WICEN will be a lot different in the future than what they were in the past. There'll be a lot more people who are, you know, like there are people very passionate about SOTA or digital communications or, you know, contesting. There are people like myself and others who are very passionate about that community, emergency, public safety communications. So there will be a much greater need for people to be resourced from clubs, where that's the grounding of the people, and then the specialised uniqueness of the work to be done will come from the specialists. That's my opinion of that, how organisations that specialise like WICEN do will change from the past to where it's moving to.
Do you finding though that that it's sort of getting to be that you lot are all getting a bit older and finding it harder for the younger generation to come up through the ranks?
Are you saying I'm getting older?
No, not you, but you.
That's why I chose to wear black tonight. That helps you.
Oh, I thought you looked
no, I think that's Heidi asking the question, and you hit the nail on the head. What do you think maybe I could ask the question of the Barrack Club is, what do you think your average age is of membership?
110.
No, it's not one you need to necessarily answer, but yes, amateur radio operators are aging. There's not a lot of, I think, maybe youth coming along, and that's where clubs will also be very useful.
If I can just respond to that, Mark, we've got quite a significant commitment to educating young people and bringing them into the hobby and catching them at a very early age. So we've got school-based learning programs for primary students and so on. So this is something that we've been looking at. The research that I've read says there's a rather interesting demographic with amateur radio operators. Most amateur radio operators don't follow through with amateur radio through their middle years. They tend to learn about it at a younger age and then drop it when they're busy working and raising kids and so on. And then you get to the sort of age group where I am, where my kids are more or less self-sufficient and I just leave them to it and I go off and play radios whenever it suits me. And this is apparently quite a widespread phenomenon with a lot of right across the world. It's the dominant demographic of amateur radio, that you start early, drop it for 30 years, and then pick it up later on when you're approaching retirement.
But you've got to instill.
There are a few.
You got to instill
What's that,
the
Heidi?
interest. You got to instill the interest at a young age into their minds and brainwash them. And
You've got to give them the bug. You've got to give them the bug early, and they'll pick it up later on. So yeah, we're interested in doing STEM learning and giving the basic skills to youngsters in the hope that they'll take it up as a career path in some area or another, and then come back to amateur radio later on, probably when most of us are not here, interestingly enough.
And that makes sense, Neil. And also I think a lot of the younger people have, while they've got that energy, maybe more frequent sort of excitement is what they're after. So things like the CFA have attracted them because they can put the red and blue flashing lights on and maybe at least once a week or the SES once a month, you know, they get out and they get to get to play, where, as we said, you know, WICEN hasn't been activated in 11 years. So we do a lot of public safety events, which really do serve a purpose. And on that, a lot of those events will not get, won't be able to operate because they will not get their insurances without having a communications plan in place. So those large public events that are quite important to the local communities from an economic point of view will not get their license to operate if they don't have a communications plan in place. Therefore, no WICEN, no event sort of thing.
We've helped out the Heathcote Marathon, or a Keith Rail Trail. They had one every year. They didn't have one this year, but they had this marathon. It's the weekend, and we were involved with the comms.
Yep.
For that, and for quite a few years, and that was quite good. We enjoyed it, and they appreciated our help. So it's very interesting, and we've done other things, but yeah, that was one of the major ones.
Yeah, and it's very important. A lot of the events that were traditionally done have faded away because of mobile phone coverage. So a lot of the events now can be run with people just using phones and using various data apps on the phone to communicate between checkpoints. But in those areas where communications is limited, you know, remote areas, high country, they just can't do it with their phones. So they are going to be reliant on another form of communication. A lot of the rallies will use commercial radio. Some of the rallies use PiNet, a commercial radio system for communications, and they will also use Rally Safe within the vehicles. Some of our experiences have been one of the benefits that I'll call it a ham radio operator can bring is a few other things in their toolbox. The ability to change bands, use different bands, the ability to use different antennas, not just a mag mount that's on top of a vehicle with a radio that's plugged into a cigarette lighter. So running higher power, better antenna systems. So I think communication specialists in those events will always have a place. Maybe once our friend Elon Musk gets his, what is it, Chris, 6,000 satellites up there, things might change. But until then, I think there'll always be a place. Do you agree with that, John and Chris?
I think 6,000 satellites sounds like another infrastructure that's ready to fail.
It sounds like another reason for us to go out in space and be able to do the comms out there between the satellites.
So maybe Heidi, you could be the first operator off to Mars or something.
Oh yes, I'm full of wind. I've got my ticket.
Because not the least of what we as amateurs can bring to anything is a repeater. It's above the other types of communications that don't have it. So that's a very valuable tool that we have.
Yeah, look, we saw with a recent event where they were just using commercially supplied radios, and all our job was to set up I think it was a base station with an antenna and hand out the handhelds. Was that right, Phil? Give me a thumbs up. Was that?
That is correct. That is correct. Yeah, that was the Mildura walk. Yeah.
Dementia Australia walk. So instead of having 6 or 7 operators out on an event,
we had 1.5.
1.5. Phil and his son set up a base station, handed out some commercial handhelds to the event people. They conducted the event, handed them back at the end of the day, and we packed them up and sent them on to the next.
Actually, interesting you should say that, Mark, because Chris and I did something similar for the, was it the Olympic relay, Chris, or something like that?
Yeah, I think it was the Queen's Baton was
That's right.
relay as a prelude to must have been the Commonwealth Games, I think, John.
Yes, it would have been, but it was a very similar setup where we were asked to do the comms planning for it. Then the actual equipment was used was commercial two-way radios, and we basically handed them out and gave instructions on how to use them. We operated the net that held it all together, and then all the radios came back and went back to the company that owned them. So that's yet another way that it can work.
Did you have exclusive use of that frequency, John, or was it a shared commercial frequency?
Well, it was a commercial frequency of that particular hire company. So in that particular area, they were digital comms, and yes, we did have sole use of that frequency.
And just on that one that we were talking about, where myself and the young bloke were up in Mildura there, that was actually equipment that came from WICEN New South Wales. Apparently they deal with all the dementia walks, but being that it was in Victoria, they asked WICEN Victoria to handle it. So all the equipment actually came from WICEN New South Wales, and it was just as Mark said, it was a 70 centimetre repeater set up and handhelds distributed across the course, where I'd done a couple of tests with the young bloke who was six at the time, or 7 at the time, and he loved it, and everyone loved him being there from 4 o'clock in the morning. So it was good. It flew the banner and had a lot of interest. And actually, I'm currently at work now, and the site supervisor noticed a big sticker on the back of my car not that long ago, and I was trying to get him to get his amateur license. So, but yeah, there you go.
Any other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, we might stop the recording and maybe continue with informal chat, but maybe Neil, you might like to officially thank the presenters, and then we'll stop the recording. Perhaps there's no other questions.
It's a bit hard to offer them a bottle of wine as a thank you for being presenters, isn't it, over the Zoom?
Well, it's virtual wine, Heidi.
Okay.
It's the latest thing. Okay, well, look, I guess that's been thrown into my court. John, Chris and Mark, thank you very much indeed for your efforts in preparing your presentations this evening. They've been absolutely first class. I didn't comment on it earlier, but I was struck by the quality of the presentations that you were made, and it was obvious that you put quite a bit of effort into them. So thank you very much indeed for your time this evening, and we look forward to having the opportunity to speak with you again at some point in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. Yes, appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks very much, Neil. It was an absolute pleasure.